Good afternoon. My name is Madam Asumta, and I will take you through this course, Modern African Poetry, and that actually needs a lot of commitment, and you are going to get a deeper understanding of modern African poetry. Focus on key poets, themes, and literary movement that have covered poetry. This course will examine the origin, the nature, the evolution, and the present state of modern African poetry. So as students, you will be exposed to poems from some selected African poets, and you are expected to do an analysis of the work and also check out the thematic preoccupation of poems of African literary works. So the expected learning outcomes are the following. By the end of this course, you should be able to study poetry and its tenets, familiarize yourself with general features of poetry, also do a critical appraisal of African and modern poetry, and also know the trends in modern African poetry. Also, you should also be able to write critically on pioneering and nationalist poetry, and also familiarize yourself with Niger Delta poetry and also the contemporary poetry. So we are going to have also some cards and assignments, and I expect that you cooperate at this course. So let us topic on. It's we are just going to get the general view of poetry because it's just the introductory part. So by the end of the lesson, the learner should be able to define terminologies used in poetry, identify the characteristics of a poem, and also explain the functions of the poem. So those are the objectives. So let us begin with what is a poem. A poem is a piece of literary creation that is creatively composed and written in a verse form. It is a self-contained piece of literary creation written in verse form. Now, the next thing is the characteristics of a poem. So, the first characteristic is that it is written in stanza or verse form. Another characteristic is that it is creatively composed. Another one, it expresses emotions. And the last one, it is compact, meaning it expresses so much in few words. So the next thing that we are going to look at is poetry. Poetry is an elevated expression of elevated thought or feeling in metrical or rhythmical form. That is poetry. Now let us focus on poet. Who is a poet? A poet is a writer in verse, especially one possessing high powers of imagination and expression. I don't know whether you have seen that poet. For a poet to be able to write, for example, they must come up with, for example, words that are matching with the last words, or maybe that words that are almost similar to the rest, maybe at the end, in the middle. So the words poet and poetry can appear neutral until light is laid onto them. In the 20th century, when literature turned against more extravagant claims, poets inherited from the Romantic movement. The words poet and poetry were given a rest. Poetry became verse and poets became practitioners. This was the period when anthologies had titles like Faber Book of Modern Verse in 1936. Now let us focus on two functions of poetry. Poetry assists in communications of feelings. Poetry touches our heart and mind since it helps to express ourselves in a healthy and cathartic way. It's an outlet for our emotion and also help us to communicate our emotions in a safe way. Another function is that poetry is a therapy form. Poetry assists in processing one's emotion and deal with difficult life experiences. So that is kind of therapy form. Another function is that poetry helps to increase our understanding of oneself and the world around us. Poetry assists in helping us view the world in a new and unexpected ways. It helps to express what we may not be able to put in words, as well as giving us a new perspective of the world that is around us. Another function is that it improves our communication skills. This is done by expressing oneself in a clear and effective manner. It also helps us to express imagination and creativity because it's a channel for creativity. And so we explore imagination, yeah. Another function is that poetry can reduce stress and anxiety. Through poetry writing, it's like a self-care. As you write poetry, you clear your mind and worries at the moment. You also explore your inner thoughts without any judgmental criticism. Poetry also helps to improve our empathy and understanding of others. When one reads poetry, you develop some empathy and understanding of others due to the characters' experiences, maybe of love, loss, or joy. So we get a greater insight into their lives and how to see the world. Poetry also helps to develop one's writing skills. Through the conscious nature of poetry, it encourages one to be creative, and one's word choices and the strict rhyme and meter requires force to, and also to make person to think carefully on what word and sound to choose. Poetry helps to connect with other people and culture. Poetry can be a gap builder, and disconnected members of community, it helps them by giving all of us a common language to share our thoughts and feelings. Poetry inspires and gives one a new perspective of life. That's another function. And it can also improve mental well-being and boost one's mood. It is also an important part of our heritage and helps us to appreciate the beauty of language. So that's all about the functions. Now, I think you have been able to see what poem means, the characteristic of a poem, what is the meaning of poetry, who is a poet, as well as the functions of poetry. So, the next thing we're going to look at is features of that in topic 2. So, by the end of the lesson, you should be able to identify the features of poetry as well as describing these features. So those are the objectives. So the first feature is imagery. Poems frequently employ vivid and descriptive language to create mental images and also to evoke sensory experiences on the reader's mind. These images can be visual, auditory, tactile, or olfactory. So the next one is figurative language. Poets often use figurative language such as metaphors. Metaphors are those like you compare something directly. Also similes, they are also figurative language. Personification, symbolism, all these, they convey complex ideas and emotions in a condensed manner. Another feature, number 3, is rhythm and meter. Many poets, they utilize patterns of stressed and unstressed syllables to express a rhythmic structure. This rhythmic pattern, it's known as meter, can vary from poem to poem and contributes to its overall musicality and flow. Another feature is rhyme. Rhyme is the repetition of similar sounds, usually at the end of a line, and add musicality, emphasis, and unity of a poem. Poets may employ various rhyme schemes, including perfect rhymes, for example, cat, yes, or slant rhymes, for example, lake, fake. Another feature is structure and form. Poem structure and form can range from traditional forms like sonnets and villanelles to modern or free verse structure. Choice structure can impact poems, meaning, pacing, and overall effect. Another feature is the economy of language. Poets often employ conscious and carefully chosen words, employing brevity to convey deeper meaning and evoke powerful emotions. Each word in a poem is significant and contributes to overall impact of the piece. Another feature is emotion and subjectivity. Poetry explores the depths of human emotion, giving voice to personal experiences, thoughts, and feelings. Can capture both the universal and the deeply personal, providing an avenue for self-expression and connection with readers. Another feature is ambiguity and multiple meanings. Poems, they embrace ambiguity and allows multiple interpretations. They can be read with different meaning, inviting readers to engage with text and derive their own understanding. Other features include completion and density. The poet must also inherit the tradition through medium of ancient. They also exhibit their writing some quality which makes them exceptional. So those are just among the features of poetry, and they are just very brief. So, next thing on, that is topic 3, is African modern poetry. So by the end of this lesson, you as a learner, you should be able to define African poetry and the genre as a genre of literature, and also understand what African poetry encompasses and also its poet. And you should be able to discuss the modern African poetry. So let us begin with African poetry. It is an important genre of literature that is rooted in the culture and oral traditions of African writers, how they convey their messages to the people, and how these poets react after consuming such messages. African poetry before colonization may be defined as the oral renditions by which African belief systems, attitudes, mode of worship, traditional communal expectation, and cultural affinity are transmitted through oral tradition methods such as songs, dirges, elegy. African poetry encompasses the wide variety of tradition arising from Africa's 55 countries and from evolving trends within different literary genres. David Diop's poetry, Africa, is seen as a form of protest against the repressive French colonial power. He was sympathetic to all his fellow men and women striving for freedom and backed the African revolutionary movement. In this poem, he addresses his feeling on African freedom and liberty. It offers a rich and diverse range of narratives that reflect the complexities of African cultures, histories, and society. By exploring African literature, readers can gain a deeper understanding of the continent's diverse cultures, traditions, and social issues, cultural preservation. So that's all about African poetry. Let's now see about modern African poetry. And before then, we need to know what modern means, what African means, and what also poetry means. So, by modern, we mean written and contemporary as opposed to traditional and oral. African, by African we mean produced by African for Africans and sharing the African experiences. Then poetry, we mean a genre of literature written in verse form using figurative language in order to express feelings and emotions. So, having learned that modern African poetry can be said to mean poetry emanating from African continent, written by Africans for the Africans audience, and authentically portraying the African experience. The concept of modern African poetry above exclude the medium of composition. Language is a factor that must be when in African poetry. Thus, issues have sparked up polemical scholarship by Obiwali, Ngugi wa Thiong'o, and others who believe that African literature must be written in African language. And Wole Soyinka, Chinua Achebe, and others who believe that European language can be bent and mastered in order to convey the complex African experience. And as a matter of fact, the debate continues. So, modern African poetry includes works written in European languages, African languages, and African works is translated in translated form. On the nature of African poetry, there is this person, Oniyitan, who says that poetry is by no means a recent import into African from Europe. It's important and living part of African cultures. Going back into distant past in nearly all African societies, there has been and still in many places a thriving oral tradition of poetry. Poetry and songs are basic human expression to accompany the activities of daily life, to give utterances to their joy and sorrow, to comment on life, or simply to entertain. Thus, this view is anchored on the ground that modern African poetry is not a new phenomenon, and even before the advent of the written tradition, Africans had their own forms of poetic expression. An authentic African world form the backdrop of modern African poetry. Ojeides views center of the local color that can be found in African poetry. Thus, the local color is drawn from African environment and culture, and without it, there is little left on African poetry. That is all about African and modern poetry. So that is the emergence of modern African poetry and the phases of African poetry. So, by the end of the lesson, this is now topic 4. The learner should be able to know how modern African poetry emerged, discuss the phases of African poetry and their development. So, let us begin with emergence of modern African poetry. It is no doubt that the political, economical, social evolution of African states have really influenced the emergence of African poetry. A mixture of culture, spiritual, politics, and emotions of African, carefully crafted through European languages, for example, English and French. These languages were domesticated to communicate Africans feelings in diverse areas of human inspiration, development, emotions, as well as disillusionment in some cases, while in others, love and cultural heritage of Africa are clearly enacted. So let us now go to the phases of African poetry and their development. Four phases were identified to have constituted to the emergence of modern African poetry. That is the pioneering phase that was in 1930s to 1940s. Then we have transitional phase that was in 1950s to early 1960s. Then we have modernist phase that was on mid 60s and early 70s. And the last phase is the liberation struggle and independence era. So these first two phases, they fall within the period of colonialism, that is the pioneering and transitional phase, while modernists and contemporary or this liberation phase, they fall under the period of independence. So these phases have been divided to enable us identify and understand the thematic preoccupation of African poets within given periods in African socio-political history, acting as a tool in public outcry, serving as garments for protest. Let us begin with pioneering and transitional phase. Poets of this era or period are basically protest-based against colonial exploitation, racial discrimination, as well as agitations for political independence. Therefore, the change from pioneer to modern was occasioned by development into two areas: techniques of poetic expression and the sources of poetic material. So next is the modernist, that was in the mid 1960s and early 1970s. This period saw African poets struggling for liberation and the struggle for independence. The political, social, and economic conditions of Africans are the predominant themes in this period. As Ngugi wa Thiong'o puts it, literature does not grow or develop in a vacuum. It's given impetus, shape, direction, and even area of concern by the social, political, and economic forces in a particular society. The relationship between creative literature and other forces cannot be ignored, especially in Africa, where modern literature has grown against the glory background of European imperialism and its changing manifestations: slavery, colonialism, neocolonialism. So our culture over the last 100 years has developed against the same stunting, dwarfing background. So the last phase is the contemporary phase or the millennium phase or the post-colonial African literature. Most African nations, they gained independence in the 1950s and 1960s, and with liberation and increased liberty and the increased literacy, African literature written in English, French, Portuguese, and traditional African languages has grown dramatically in quantity and have gained also global recognition. In the development of modern literature since 1935, the UNESCO's General History of Africa and people like Ali Mazrui, they mentioned 7 conflicts as theme. For example, the theme of clash between African past and present, between traditional and modernity. There also a theme of clash between indigenous and foreign, clash between individualism and community, between socialism and capitalism, between development and self-reliance, and also between African and humanity. They also tracked social issues like corruption, economic disparities in these newly independent countries. Yeah, so that's all about emergence of modern African poetry, as well as what? The phases of poetry.